Hello, everyone. I'm Simon from Five Leaves, and I'd just like to welcome everybody and thank you for coming along. I'll hand over to Grant in just a second, but I just want to do a quick little bit of housekeeping. If you've got questions at any point throughout the evening, put them in the Q&A box along the bottom, and we'll get to them in due course. And honestly, I think that's pretty much all I need to say tonight. Grant, who will be hosting, grew up in Nottingham and he's been out as bi for half his life. And he says he's very happy to be here. So I'll hand over to Grant to do the rest. Thanks.
Okay. So thank you very much for hosting this and having this. And thanks very much to Lois for having the reason to have this. So I'm Grant, and I first came out as bi. I've lived in Nottingham. I was quite a few times. I was born there, and very pleased that when I was first coming out, there was a bi group. There was a long-running bi group in Nottingham. There's been a bi women's group, Bitopia. It's met in pubs. I've been very pleased when I was in Nottingham to have that, and also for there to be radical bookshops, for there to be community bookshops. And I know Five Leaves and the staff have quite a history and understanding of where that is, because I've been involved with another book, The Purple Prose, which we launched a while ago, which is another bi UK book. And one of the things we understood is, if you don't think there will be a thing to look for, if you don't think there'll be a bi thing, a bi community, a bi book, other people out there, you don't necessarily think to look. And seeing something on a bookshelf and events like this really do help us find out that such a thing does exist, and finding out a bit more what it is, because books are great. I mean, I love Five Leaves as a bookshop, but you can take a book anywhere. You can read it quietly, you can read it privately, you can share it with your friends. It's different than the bits and pieces of a blog or a video or something like that. I think there's something very special and about books and the size of them. So I'm not going to talk about me, because that's not why I'm here. I'm very, very pleased to be introducing Lois Shearing and the book, By the Way. So I will pass over for a little more information, maybe a bit of reading, and then we'll have plenty of questions, I'm sure, and things to talk about from there. So welcome, and over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you so much for Five Leaves for organising this and having both of us. I really appreciate it. And I know I speak for Grant when you really appreciate it as well. So thank you, Five Leaves. So this is my book, my debut book, By the Way. Came out 2 months ago now, which is very exciting and also very surreal. Having it lived in my head for so long, for now people to be talking to me about it is a really weird experience. So yeah, like Grant said, part of the reason I wrote this is because whilst there are bi books out there, they often aren't in the main bookstores. Like I say in the beginning of this book that I regularly go into Waterstones and Foyles and WH Smith and look in their LGBT and gender sections, and only twice in the whole time I've been doing that for a good 10 years have I ever found books specifically about bisexuality. And so hopefully by writing one which is quite introductory and quite mainstream, it'll be a way for young people in particular to stumble upon it and hopefully find out a bit more about themselves, because I think a lot of bi people, the way we learn about ourselves and about bisexuality is quite buckshot. I got a lot of my information from Tumblr, which was both a great resource and a horrible resource, which I think a lot of people who are on Tumblr will agree with, and kind of, books about other sexualities that normally skirted around bisexuality. And so I wanted to just create a resource where the introductory basic stuff, and obviously you don't actually need to know anything about bisexuality to be bisexual. There isn't a test that you have to pass to get your license or anything. But it can be quite useful to have that background when you're figuring yourself out. So on the topic of backgrounds, I was planning on reading a little bit from what is my favorite chapter, which is chapter 6, which is called How Long Has Bisexuality Been Around? Which just covers the history of the bisexual community and movement and the word itself. So I'm just going to read a little bit of that if everyone's happy with that. Grant, can I just ask you, I know sometimes my voice can get a little bit low, so if I get quiet, please just give me a hand signal to project my voice a bit more. Awesome. Take a quick drink. Chapter 6, How Long Has Bisexuality Been Around? For as long as there have been humans who were attracted to multiple genders. In every phase of history, every civilization, every part of the world has been chock full of people who today might identify as bi/pan/queer, etc. The same is true for gay men, lesbians, trans and non-binary, and asexual people, and every flavor of queerness there is, which is infinite in my opinion. There are a few different ways you can approach the vastness of bi history. You can reach back through the archives and find people who had relationships or showed attraction to different genders across their lives and claim them as bi. You can focus only on people who identified themselves as bi. You can look into the ways in which bi people have been pathologized and ostracized by others. You can just focus on the many, many achievements of bi community groups and organizations. In true bi fashion, I'm interested in a bit of everything. While I think it can be problematic to I can't even say this word, anachronistically, which means ahistorically or out of its time, apply modern labels to figures for whom these identities may not have existed, I also understand the importance of acknowledging the queerness of our ancestors, icons, and enemies. By that I mean that we can and should acknowledge and shout about historical figures who appeared to have been multi-gender attracted, but it's also important to be aware that throughout most of history, queerness was forcibly erased and invisibilized, meaning people may not have fully been able to comprehend or express their own experiences. People who may appear to us as bi may have actually identified as gay or ace or any number of identities if they had had access to our words and knowledge. If you look back through history, there are countless people who could have fitted into multiple of today's identities, and there are just as many arguments about which they truly were. I find those arguments to be a waste of time because we can never know. They do nothing but sow seeds of division within our community and perpetuate the idea that queer identities and experiences can always be neatly separated from each other and don't overlap. In today's world, Sappho, the famous poet from Lesbos, may have identified as a lesbian or bi or pan or even something completely different. She didn't have access to any of those words, and trying to claim her as definitely one or the other deprioritizes the way in which our experiences as lesbians or bi or pan women overlap and look alike one another. She is an important figure to all women who love women, and that's all that matters to me. With that in mind then, this is a whistle-stop tour of bisexual history, which comprises of 3 parts. Pre-bi history, i.e. multi-gender attracted people and the communities that existed before the word bisexual. The emergence of bisexuality as a defined experience and community. And finally, the bisexual movement from its inceptions in the 70s until now, which I'm writing in 2021. Proto-bisexuality. Mary Wollstonecraft is often called a proto-feminist because while she was a dedicated women's rights activist, feminism as a political movement or defined ideology and framework had not yet been established at the time of her writing. Bisexuality as a concept and identity has a specific context. It relies on a certain understanding of gender, attraction, and sexuality. Our concept of bisexuality began to emerge in the late 1800s, along with society's understanding, or misunderstanding might be more accurate, of heterosexuality and homosexuality. But this didn't stop people from desiring, loving, and fucking people of all different genders. The ancient world was full of practices and people who would perhaps now label themselves as bisexual. In ancient Greece, it was not uncommon for free men to have relationships with women and younger men. Interestingly, this became more common, or at least more open, part of Greek life after the city became a city-state. Eva Contrella writes in Bisexuality and the Ancient World, after Sappho in Greece, love between women was no longer the subject of poetry. How could it have been any different when one considered that it was the strengthening of bonds of citizenship? Women had been regulated to a reproductive role, excluded from all forms of education, and consequently from the use of language. In the centuries of the city-state, female homosexuality disappeared as a socially visible and significant custom. At the same time, male homosexuality came out as a manner of speaking. It should be noted here that Eva uses homosexual to refer to any same-sex/gender desire or relationships, which strikes me as a bit ironic in a book about bisexuality. The practice of men having relationships with younger men was known as pedestry, and it is arguable that pedestry was more common than bisexuality, as boys were seen as having a class status closer to women than men, meaning men engaging with younger boys was not seen as on par with engaging sexually with other men. It's also important to note that many of these relationships would have been predatory and even considered pedophilia today. Around a similar time, bisexuality was seemingly in vogue in another Mediterranean climate. In ancient Rome, it was considered permissible for a freeborn man to have sex with men and women, provided he always took a penetrative role. This seems to have been the ancient Roman version of no homoing their relationships with other men, in the same way which today we see frat boys claim that sucking each other off isn't gay because it's part of an initiation. It is interesting to see how in both of these cultures, the binary applied to sexuality was not gender, but rather penetrating/being penetrated, as a way of determining who was the active, strong/dominant party, or the passive, weak, and submissive participant, in a way that we still see applied to gender roles today. Same shit, different centuries. Some notable Greco-Romans who dabbled in multi-gender flings include Socrates, the Greek philosopher, who was married to a difficult woman but had an eye for beautiful boys, especially his student, oh God, I'm gonna get this Greek name so wrong, Alcibiades. You'll just have to read that, I'm sorry if I've mispronounced it. And Julius Caesar, who, despite being married, bedded both Cleopatra and King Nicomedes. Ancient Japan also saw its fair share of bisexuality and homosexuality amongst Buddhist monks, with many stories of same-sex love affairs appearing in countless literary works. Monks were among the first people to rationalize pedestry in Japan. The violent spread of Christian morality during the Dark Ages meant any hint of queerness and gender nonconformity has been erased and suppressed in the pages of history, and possibly at the time too. But nothing can or will ever stamp it out, and multi-gender attracted people continue to love and to exist. One of my favorite examples is playwright William Shakespeare, who, long before becoming the bane of every school child's life, was writing sonnets for his paramours of varying genders and infusing his tales with gender bending and queer love. Willie Shake is also one of my favorite examples of bi-erasure, as one theory posits that he was actually several people writing under a pseudonym, so the sonnets written for women were by men and vice versa. There are several other notable people who showed bisexual behavior before bi became the identity that we know of it today, including, but certainly not limited to, Michelangelo, Casanova, Marie Antoinette, Lord Byron, Hans Christian Andersen, Alexander Hamilton, Virginia Woolf, Marlene Dietrich, Eleanor Roosevelt, Greta Garbo, Billie Holiday, Josephine Baker, Frida Kahlo, Edna St. Vincent Millay, Aleister Crowley, Colette, Francis Bacon, Tallulah Bankhead, Tamara Delimpica, Mary Wollstonecraft, and many, many, many others. And I will stop there. I think that's a good rounding off point.
Thank you. That's brilliant. It's great to hear how you say
thank you.
what you say and hear it in your voice, because otherwise I don't hear you. I really liked the the style of talking about both serious things and keeping a sense of humor all the way through. I think that's really important. When you write, do you tend to aim for a certain style? I mean, is this just how you speak?
So my day job is also as a content writer. I currently work for a education agency, but I've bounced around different content writing jobs. And of course, I also do a lot of freelance articles and writing, most of which is also about bisexuality. And so I definitely have what I would call like my content voice, which is a sort of a tone of voice that I switch into. But I like to keep it fairly similar to the way that I talk, because I think that's most accessible to people. You know, I enjoy reading very heavy literary things. I'm currently rereading Lolita for like the third time, but that's not a great way of like educating and sharing knowledge. And so I think it's important to keep it accessible, keep it as if you're having a conversation, and also to find joy in it. Like I think something that the queer community does really well is take a lot of kind of the trauma and the hatred and the suppression and the erasure that we're faced with and kind of reclaim it and make it into jokes and bring humor into it. So I was kind of trying to do that a little bit, and hopefully it came across.
Absolutely. And you were saying about learning about bisexuality kind of in bits and pieces and dribs and drabs. Are there particular things that stick with you that you've read or heard that you sort of think of now?
Oh, that's such a good question. Because I read so many books and resources whilst writing this one that it's kind of supplanted a lot of the memories of my earlier stuff that I read. But online stuff has been really important. There's been some like online writers who've really stuck out to me. So Shiri Eisner, I actually read their book a couple of years ago, and sort of before I even knew that existed, some like Tumblr and Twitter accounts and freelance writers. So kind of Bren, who runs the BiPan library now. At the time, she was writing a lot of stuff on both Tumblr and Twitter that I found really illuminating. Heron Goldsmith, I think her surname is, writes a lot of stuff about being bisexual and non-binary, and also being a bisexual parent, which I find fascinating. And kind of, I remember finding their Twitter several years ago and reading a lot of their threads. And also Libby Baxter Williams, Biscuit was a great resource for me. I think I read like all of their articles when I first moved to London. And it was actually Libby who got me involved in writing about bisexuality, because I offered to write a few articles for the Biscuit website, and now this has happened. So thank you, Libby.
So we're starting to get some other questions as well, if you're happy to have those. Yeah. One of which bi historical figures would you most like to meet?
Oh, that's such a good question. I mean, I would love to meet Shakespeare for several reasons. Firstly, I'm a bit of a literature nerd, and obviously he's like one of the greatest writers of all time. But also just to find out the truth, you know, there's so many things like what I put in the book that people think he was several different people, that people think he was an alias. So I'd love to meet him. I'd also really love to meet Brenda Howard, who's a figure from quite recent bi history. So she's known as like the mother of Pride. She organized some of those first Pride parades. And Cynthia Slater, similarly, was a bi activist around a similar time. They would be very cool to meet. And also Virginia Woolf, again, for similar reasons, but I think she'd be really cool to meet as well. That's a very fun question. Thank you for that one.
Yeah. And the next one we've got is around bisexuality and gender. Is bisexuality more common among women or men, presuming there is even research that tells us that? Do we know this?
So I'm not sure if we can say whether it's more common, but we can definitely say that more women are out than men.
Mm-hmm.
So off the top of my head, I think the statistics are something around 46% of people who identify as bi are out. 46% of women who identify as bi are out to their friends and loved ones. Whereas with bi men, the number is something like 12% of bi men are out to their friends and loved ones. So it appears to be more common in women only because women are so much more likely to be out than bi men. And of course, bisexual people in general are less likely to be out than gay or lesbian people. I think something like 65% of gay men are out to their friends and family, and it's something like, sorry, sirens outside. And it's something like 61% for lesbians. And figures for non-binary people are currently non-existent, unfortunately. They're starting to get a little better, like Stonewall, I think, is doing some stuff around that, but definitely not the same level of research. So I would be hesitant to say that it's more common for women, but I would say that women are more likely to be out, which we could talk all day about kind of the benefits and drawbacks of being out compared to being, obviously being out is a good thing, but the reason bi women are more out is because not necessarily because bi women are more accepted, but because bi women are more sexualized and fetishized, which can sometimes be confused with acceptance. So there's more bi representation of women, but often that representation is not good. Whereas bi men, there's a lot less representation. And you could argue bi men are less fetishized than bi women, but I think we're getting into territory there, which we don't really know. So it's hard to say. I hope that was useful.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you were writing, I'm thinking particularly of one of the last chapters about what problems do bi people face. And even though I've seen those numbers before and I see that amongst my friends, it's still horrendous.
Yeah.
You know, it's just, you look at the room, you look at the percentage and you just think, okay, that many people in this room are having or have had such a difficult life. How do you deal with researching that stuff and being okay?
That chapter was a hard one to write. A friend of mine who got an advance copy and actually ended up reading it kind of the night before it came out said that after reading that chapter, even though like you, they knew all the statistics, seeing them all collated together like that, they had to kind of go and have a sit down for a few minutes. And it is a chapter that a lot of people have commented on because I think it is quite shocking because there's this kind of misconception about bisexuality that it's a bit of an easy ride and that, you know, we're kind of riding on the coattails of the gay movement, and the idea of like bi privilege has haunted online discourse for many years. Whereas actually when you look at the numbers, you know, the bi community faces higher rates of addiction, poverty, homelessness, sexual violence, mental health issues, many issues. So it was really heavy to research, especially because, like you said, like myself and a lot of the people I know have had those experiences. But luckily I have a background as a journalist. And I have another project which has just come out, which is about women in the alt-right. And I've done a lot of other like very heavy subjects. And so I've built up the methods to be able to sort of not see it emotionally. I'm very good at switching off that part of my brain when I'm writing about those heavier things. So touch wood, that's how I got through that chapter.
And which bits did you enjoy most?
So my favorite one to write was the one I just read, chapter 6. I have several memories of kind of crying in Starbucks around different parts of London, just reading about all of these different stories from our history that we just aren't really told, or that you have to really search to find. Like, I read a very long story about Robin Ox, the bi activist, who was one of the first people to enter into a same-sex marriage. And I read kind of the story about her and her wife and how they campaigned for same-sex marriage laws and also for like bi visibility. And it was like, I'm getting emotional about it now. It's just such a beautiful story. And kind of lots of stories like that about different parts of bi history were really, really affirming and lovely to write about. And I also really enjoyed writing the chapter on dating. That one's probably one of the lightest chapters. So that was a lot of fun to get people to share their dating stories with me, to include in that.
So we've got another question on the fun side of things, possibly. Do you have a favourite bi character in literature or TV or film, even if they're a problematic favourite, maybe?
You know what? I recently, over lockdown, rewatched Jennifer's Body. That's a very problematic film, but it's so good. She's one of my favourite bi characters. I love Stephanie Beatrice as Rosa, Brooklyn Nine-Nine. I think that's a really well-handled storyline. In literature, a book that I would recommend that has a great bi protagonist is a book called Vow of Celibacy. The author's name escapes me right now, but it's a very fun, kind of bubbly sort of YA about a plus-sized bisexual woman who decides to take a vow of celibacy for a year. And of course, I think we can all guess what happens. So that's a fantastic book. I highly recommend checking that one out.
Fantastic. And there is a bi competition for books each year, which I recommend you enter if you haven't already, because it's always interesting.
I was mentioning Vow of Celibacy. I think it won the Bi Book Awards a couple of years ago. So very good.
Yeah. And do you have just as a fun thing, one of the questions I've sometimes had for people is, being bi, how do you find partners who will accept you or appreciate you, or do you have tips for dating while bi?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I've been exploring in the last year. So I was in like 2 long-term relationships, sort of back to back, and now I'm sort of single again for the first time in my adult life after many years. And so I've been like launched into the dating world again, which has been fun, but also my tip is, if you're using apps, maybe put it in your profile, which you do get some weird messages, but it's a good way of filtering out people straight off the bat. And then something I have done, which I don't know if this is good advice or not, it's just something I've personally done, is if I'm on a date with like a man or a woman, I will mention an active crush or attraction I have to someone of a different gender to them. And then just gauge their reaction to that. But obviously you have to be sort of a little bit out in order to do that, and you have to be prepared for their reaction. But that's a good way of gauging people's perceptions, because I'm sure a lot of people on this call know, and Grant, I'm sure you know, that people aren't super hot about dating bi people sometimes. So that can make things difficult.
And one of the questions we've just had come in is about not necessarily finding dates, but finding community. Is, a lot of people are all over the internet, but if you're not into social media, or maybe you don't want to be out to whoever reads your social media, or just not into that, how do you find community? How do you do that these days?
I mean, it's still really difficult. It's still difficult for all queer people, but I think especially for kind of what I call like the non-binary identities, like bi and pan people, like non-binary gender people. Especially if you're not out, but I think if you're at school or university or college, there's often kind of LGBT societies, which can be a bit hit or miss, but they're, if you even just go there a few times, you'll meet other queer people. Workplaces, if you're in quite a large workplace, will often have LGBT networks, which can be quite good. There's a good one called My Gay Work, which, whilst the name isn't super inclusive, I know a few fantastic bi activists who are part of kind of the organizers. And so they help people set up like queer networks within their workplace, which is really useful. I mean, you could post a flyer. Don't post flyers. But yeah, in the final chapter, there's kind of a list of different bi groups around the UK and around Europe and America. So they are out there. I think meet up if you're not on social media but still have access to the internet is a good way of finding queer groups as well.
And I would want to add as well, some of the things you put in there are events that happen. BiFest being a one-day event, Bi Pride has happened, BiCon, which is a national get-together, has been going on. So there are physical meetups, clearly disrupted somewhat these days. And you've also mentioned things like Bi Community News and sort of other media that comes out on print. You can get it pushed through your door. Yes. So I'm really glad to see that level of detail. So it is out there. And I think some of it is knowing it's out there.
And I think that was one of the struggles that I hope this doesn't offend you, but I think a few years younger than you. And I'm sure you came out, you know, at a different time to me. But I think even across that time difference, we both had that struggle of, okay, so I found that there's like a local gay group, but where the hell do I go for other bisexual people? And it took me a really long time to find like BiFest and BiCon and Bi Community News, especially because I grew up in a really rural area. And so I'm hoping that by just putting that in the book, obviously that's not even like the be all and end all of bi communities, but it's at least a good directory to start. Like Bi Community News and Bi Index has just a web page dedicated to all of the bi groups that are out there in the UK that you can go and find them and check them out.
And you've mentioned already, you know, favorite TV shows, favorite literature, sometimes fans of particular genres, particular books, particular things might be good places to find bi people, particular types of music. Don't know whether you have favorite fan groups at the moment who are super bi friendly.
I'm not sure at the moment. I mean, something that I hope to get a chance to write about in the future was the kind of overlap of the emo subculture and bisexuality. I, probably surprising to no one, was very involved in like the emo subculture as a teen, and it was kind of how I managed to come out because everyone was bi in the emo subculture. Particularly bi friendly like fandoms and stuff. I'm not too sure on that one. I mean, I think Sex Education that's on Netflix, which is out at the moment, is a very good one. But two people to follow on Twitter who talk about a lot of fandom stuff and bisexuality would be Erin, whose name on Twitter is Queerly Autistic, and also Vineet, who I co-run a YouTube channel with. Vineet Mehta, he is a lot more into kind of like fandoms and online communities than me, and talks a lot about bisexuality in them. So he will definitely have some good resources on that.
And I recognize that name as, you know, someone I spot around the media and also I believe writing as well.
Vineet and I are actually co-editing an anthology together, which will hopefully come out in a few years. So
hey, watch this space.
Yeah.
And one of the things you mentioned briefly that I know has been a really important thing for many people, which is something that people may not want to be out about, but is really useful to know about, is the Bi Survivors Network. Is there anything you want people to know about that?
I mean, I guess the first thing is that we exist. So the Bi Survivors Network is a mostly virtual network that I set up a few years ago, and we run fortnightly chats on Telegram, just because bi people in general, but particularly bi women and bi women of color and disabled bisexual people face just shockingly high rates of sexual violence. I think the UN in a report a few years ago called it terrifying, which the fact that none of the mainstream LGBT organizations don't all have campaigns dedicated to it is a hill that I will die on. But that's, that's besides the point. But yeah, BSN, we're on Twitter, we have a website, we run chats, and it's a good place to get support, peer-to-peer support, if that's something that affects you. And it's definitely something that I hope we see more organizations focusing on in the future. Because again, as I talk about a lot in the book, and as we've discussed a little bit, I think it's very much just accepted that anything that caters to gay people will cover bi people as default. And that's not the case. And when you have something as difficult as mental health issues, sexual violence, addiction, poverty, you need something that's going to be completely welcoming to you completely. So I set up BSN because I was looking for survivor support. And it just felt like there was either mainstream stuff, which sort of considered, which wasn't always very queer friendly, or there were the queer ones, which were mostly catered to like same-sex relationships. And I think that's a problem that's not just relegated to survivors. Like I said, I think that's an issue for bi people looking support around mental health issues, homelessness, et cetera. So hopefully, if we're all loud enough, we'll start seeing the big LGBT organizations start to send some money and time and resources our way.
Absolutely. And that really fits in nicely with one of the questions that's just come in of what do you think major political issues faced by the bi plus community are right now? And what can we do as activists to campaign for them? There's what's going on and what can we do about it?
Great question. There are so many things facing the bi community right now that I wrote a whole chapter dedicated to it. But I think I don't want to get too dark here. Obviously, as I've just mentioned, I spent a lot of earlier this year researching the alt-right for a different project. But things are real scary right now, kind of globally and politically, when we look at like Poland and Hungary and the things that are happening with LGBT rights out there, when we look kind of at the rise in just half of UK feminists seem to have just gone slightly mad. And that transphobia is like absolutely rife at the moment. And I don't know if people saw, but there was kind of a column in the Telegraph this week about someone talking about like his woke snowflake daughter who has decided she's bisexual and how this links to kind of the madness around the GRA reform. And it's kind of, that sort of stuff is really worrying. So yeah, I think it's important that we are fighting for kind of better LGBT and queer visibility in general and like rights and protections, but remembering that bi-specific issues are worth fighting for as well. I think often in kind of the conversations, and this isn't just online or in person, this is in like actual organizations, it's kind of like, well, we need to, fight for the rights of like gay and trans people, and the bi issues get overlooked because they're considered lesser issues or less visible or whatever. But bi people and bi issues are absolutely worthy and deserving of attention and being fought for, because not only are bi people worthy of being fought for, but also that fight will kind of trickle out into the rest of the fight, and help improve things for trans and gay and ace and lesbian and non-binary and people. So what you can do about it is a big question. I think there are a lot of bi activist groups out there. I think the first one is see what's out there, because a lot of people get involved thinking there's nothing at all out here. I have to start the bi movement myself. But actually, it's been going since the 70s and before. So there's lots of stuff out there. So find what's out there first near you. Get involved. I've actually started a TikTok channel where I talk about how to get into bi activism. I think my name on TikTok is Lois Faith 95. But a great game, which I recommend everyone play, is a game that I called Not the Only Bisexual, which is where you're at an event, like a queer event or a political event. You have to make sure the word bisexual is said at least once, said out loud. So that can be asking a question, raising a comment, taking a little flag with you that you just wave wildly throughout the event. And it's about just making sure that we are always included in the conversations that we have to be included in.
Are there things you'd like friends, family, allies, co-workers, randoms on the street who don't come under bi umbrella to do or to not do, to know?
I think not do is don't ask us if we're sure. We're pretty sure. And even if we're not, that's still valid and worthy of acceptance. If someone says, I think I might be bi, but maybe I could be this other thing, saying, well, you've got to make up your mind. It's just not helpful to anyone. So don't ask us if we're sure. I think make sure you include us. Make sure we're not just an afterthought in conversations. Stop sexualizing us is a big one. Stop thinking that all bi people are like insatiable and whatever. Also understanding that it's not this kind of 50-50 split, or that people go like back and forth from one to the other. It's messy and it's fluid and it's all sorts of different things. And yeah, I think just taking the time to learn about the bi community and the bi movement, because we have been making so much content over the years. The bi community, there is like, when I was researching this, I was just overwhelmed by the amount of like content and resources that I ended up finding with a little bit of effort. And of course, not everyone has the ability to do all that research, but it is out there and you can learn about us. And I think I wish people would do that more.
And read your book. People should read your book. Yeah. And when we're on books, someone was saying, is there anything more we want to say about the Bi Book Awards? I don't know whether you want to say something to that, or if I could.
Yeah, no, go for it, please.
Yeah, so the Bi Book Awards, it's run by a Bi Writers group, and the URL for that has been popped up in the chat. It was sort of a response to there not being a lot of bi books highlighted or obviously bi, even though there are some, and perhaps them not being highlighted in the mainstream, but also not in the gay press, or not in, maybe there's one category. So it's grown over the years. Now there's all sorts of categories of bi books. There's bi books that are fiction, there's non-fiction, there's poetry, there's sort of fan fiction, there's all sorts of things. So this has really grown, and I actually got to read a little bit at the Bi Book Awards in New York because I happened to be there. I didn't fly over specially, I just happened to be there, and it was brilliant just to hear that, partially all the things I might want to read, but just to know that when you put all these books together year on year from the awards, and they're the ones I think are the best ones, there's a whole bookshelf. It's not one or two, and really liked hearing that. So it's a good thing to look out for, let's say, good books.
And I also am a big fan of the bi community starting our own awards, because like you said, not just in books, I think in like the kind of the diversity awards and the kind of activism awards that pop up in kind of LGBT spaces really do overlook like the bi community and the work that we're doing. And so I think there's like more and more awards that are kind of coming out that the bi community is like, right, if you won't give us our roses, we'll give them to ourselves. And And I'm a really big fan of that, and I really appreciate the Bi Book Awards for kind of doing that and highlighting bi writers.
One of the other questions that's come in is back to considering that bisexual community faces high rates of mental health issues. Do you think it's difficult for people to find therapists and counsellors who understand them and the issues they face? And I'm interested in this one myself because that's what I do for a living.
Yeah, I have like two personal stories of me facing this. One is like I went to therapy several years ago. I've been kind of doing therapy on and off for like the last 5 years. And after coming out as bisexual to my first therapist, in the next session, she asked me like, oh, I just wanted to ask, do bi people also face homophobia as well as like gay and lesbian people? And I was like, oh my God, like I'm paying you. I shouldn't be having to educate you in this time, you know? And then I had another therapist who kept saying some very low-key sort of things that I now recognize as a bit transphobic to me whenever we talk about bisexuality. And I was a bit like, oh, that's weird that you would say that and bring that up. So yes, it is very difficult. I think it's difficult for all queer people to find like good therapists. And then for bi people, there's another layer of difficulty because even if your therapist is gay, they might not understand bisexuality very well. I would recommend a website called Pink Therapists. You probably know more about this than me. Is how I found my current therapist, and it's just a list of LGBT therapists in the UK. But I think something that would be great for the bi community, and this is something that, again, I think the bigger orgs need to like give us some money for, is creating resources about mental health and about bi people's mental health for therapists and for counselors and for kind of mental health services. I think that's really lacking at the moment. There is a very good booklet, and I'm sorry to Five Leaves, I keep mentioning things and then you're dropping the links in the chat, but there's a great booklet called so I think it's By Mind. It might be called By the Way actually as well. Anyway, Mind has a booklet about bisexuality, which is very good. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. I'm sorry. It might be called Mind the Gap, actually.
Oh, okay. Yeah. And I think one of the things is if you have a choice of therapists, which some people don't have so much choice, but it's all right to ask them.
Absolutely.
You know, it's all right to shop around. It's all right to ask if they're culturally competent. Yeah, and you know, say it's my job as well, and I want this in education. I often, because I work with universities, I often want this taught way down the line. You know, I'd like people to know about bisexuality since they're little kids, not as an add-on.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Are there things you would have liked to have known when you were first coming out, or like to have heard, or like, are there things you would have liked?
Like I said, I grew up in a really rural area.
Yeah.
So I think the first one is just knowing that like there are people also like this who are also in my area who I could have found community and connection to. And like I said, I got lucky when I was in secondary school because like the emo subculture was at its height and everyone was exploring gender fluidity and sexual ambiguity. But I came out quite young. I came out at 14. And there was absolutely no resources available. And something else I wish I'd known sooner was that bisexuality isn't 50-50 men and women. And also that it's not just men and women. You know, the concept of non-binary genders was not something that entered my life until my late teens, when I went to university and left my small town and was like, oh my God, there's such a bigger world out here that I wasn't aware of. So that would have been really useful. And I think just the idea that you don't have to prove your bisexuality to anyone in any way. we don't ask, like, obviously everyone is assumed straight until proven otherwise, but when a 14-year-old, for example, says they like different genders, nobody says to them, well, you haven't slept with this, you haven't had sex with anyone, so how can you know? Whereas when you're a bisexual teenager, at least for me, and this is, going back like 10 years, there was a lot of, well, how can you know if you like girls as well? Or, you have to get a girlfriend now to prove that you like girls, and kind of all of this stuff. And it very much felt like there was a pressure that I had to dip my toes in the water, so to speak. And I wish that pressure wasn't on for any teenagers, gay teenagers, straight teenagers, that you don't have to prove anything, you can just know.
Mm-hmm. So we've got another question about how, because we're talking about quite a big thing sometimes, about how do we get taken seriously as a community? And there's a question about if our main contribution to big discourse seems to be about whether we like lemon bars or Kapow jeans and all the bi memes that go around. There's just that sort of reading that some bi spaces online are just places to post mediocre memes, ignoring anything real or things that people need in real life. Help! Where do you go with that?
I think like meme spaces and kind of spaces to be jokey and social are important. We deserve to have like fun and entertainment and our own like little subculture, but yeah, there is kind of a big lack of I don't know, I totally get that feeling of sometimes it feels like we're like not focusing on the right things, or I'm like, why is no one yelling about this in the street every day of the week? And the answer is because we have no funding. And when you have no funding, you end up with 10 people running like the same 20 groups around the UK and burning out and being overstretched, not being able to provide the resources and the community and the fight that we deserve. And so the answer is we yell at Stonewall and GLAAD and every other LGBT organization that's out there, and our politicians and everyone else to give us money, show us the money, damn it. And then we use that money to pay volunteers, to hire people, to create shelters and community centers and everything else under the sun. But I do think it would be cool to get more politically active as a, I keep saying community, but obviously bi people are very diverse and nowhere near a monolith. London Bi Pandas, which kind of existed for a fleeting time between like 2019 and 2020, was like a specific political group, and that got a lot of very cool work done. Yeah, I think it's just about getting better organized, and we'll get better organized with better visibility and with better funding. But also, if you want more political bi groups, you could start one. Like, I don't mean that callously. I hope it comes across enthusiastically, but like my words of advice to anyone who wants to get involved in bi activism is like, just fucking do it. Just start a Facebook group in your local area that's like, we are bisexual and we are going to write to our MP every day until they acknowledge this issue. Or we are a group of bisexuals who are going to go fight for reproductive justice. And being visibly bi in other fights will help with that. But yeah, just find a load of your friends who are also bisexual and be like, hey, do you want to take a load of bi flags down to City Hall and yell at them? Like, do it.
Brilliant. So we've got about 5 minutes left in the hour. I'll do another quick book plug for 5 Leaves of, a lot of the things we've mentioned, other books, other writing. They can get books. They will get books. They will send them to you. They will get them in. No problem. I really enjoyed your book. I'm really pleased that it exists, and I hope lots of people read it and respond to it. Something I know from Purple Prose, it's getting reviews, getting people to know there is a book out there. Even if you completely disagree with it, that's fine. Write another book. but getting some sort of that knowledge and words around that is really important. I'd like to finish with just one more question, really, is what would you like to know from the future? What do you want to know from future you about bisexuality, anything related, anything connected with the world? If you had, someone come back and tell you things, or the universe tell you something you'd like to know around bisexuality, what would you like to know? What questions have you got?
Oh, that's such a good question. I would want to know how our language evolves. I think the hashtag teens are evolving language around sexuality at a phenomenal rate, and it's, in my opinion, really fucking cool to see happen. Because I'm like, whoa, you guys are talking about and verbalizing experiences at such a young age that I hadn't even thought about, and it's because you have all this language now. It's awesome. So I would want to see that. I think I'd have some really dull, researcher questions about does the law change? Like, a lot of our laws now rest on what's called the immutability defense, which is the idea that being gay, being queer, being trans is an immutable characteristic. And I personally would like to see the laws and the way we approach that change to embrace fluidity and choice a bit more. Heron Greensmith on Twitter has some great resources about that if people are interested. And also, for me personally, I would want to ask myself, how does it all work out for us? Do we stay identifying as bi? Do we write more books? Do we fall in love? What gender is the person we fall in love with? So yeah, that would be my questions, I think. That's a really fun question. Thank you.
Excellent answer. So we're coming up to the hour. I don't know whether anyone from Five Leaves wants to jump in at the end, but I do want to finish by thanking you very much for writing this, for coming and talking to us. Thank you to everyone that's come and been involved and asked all these amazing questions. And thanks to our hosts. So I'll see if Five Leaves want to jump in, and I'll finish off there. So
and
thanks all.
Fran, for being an amazing host. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.